I know when people say they are going to spit out a hot take or an unpopular opinion, it's just a vanilla non-mainstream opinion. So how about an actual hot take for a change? Red Dead Revolver is not just the best Red Dead game, but is the only great game Rockstar ever made.
What did you say, boy?
So Red Dead Revolver was actually my first Red Dead game. I played it around the time it was released. Back then, I was obsessed with Vice City, which introduced me to my first taste of the open-world genre. My parents banned me soon after seeing me slaughter people in the streets with a chainsaw. I still played it secretly. However, my parents allowed me to play Red Dead Revolver because it wasn't like GTA. It had a lot of Rockstar-style violence, but it left me a disappointment when I discovered I couldn't just mow down people at the town level. I still enjoyed it enough to beat it, but Neversoft's gun fulfilled that crime-roaming open-world fantasy. So when I learned there was going to be a sequel, the exact open-world Western game that I wanted to play since Revolver, I was ecstatic. I picked Redemption up for full price for Xbox 360 and I quit it halfway through. I didn't know why then. I finished Gun, but I found myself too bored to play Redemption. I assumed the game was too highbrow for me. When Red Dead Redemption 2 came out, I picked it up with more cautious expectations, only to be disappointed more. I quit that game sooner than I did with Redemption 1. Recently, I have been replaying Red Dead Revolver. I replayed the classic GTA games again and didn't like them. GTA 3 is just entirely outdated, and I had some fun with Vice City and San Andreas, but the core gameplay loop isn't particularly good. I replayed Max Payne 3 and thought it was decent, but doesn't hold a candle against 1 and 2. It had fun combat, but the absurd amount of cinematic interruption in the gameplay and railroaded corridor level design ruined the experience for me. Manhunt was just a frustrating stealth game where stealth sucks. However, Red Dead Revolver immediately clicked with me in a way the Redemption games didn't. It was the only game that stood out to me as a genuinely great gameplay experience. It is an old console game, but its moment-to-moment gameplay is far ahead of anything Rockstar has published since, and it's not even close. I think this is one of my favorite pure third-person shooters alongside Vanquish, Max Payne 1, Stranglehold, and Guns. The problem with Rockstar and the other modern AAA studios is that they have realized their games shouldn't be all about action bits back by the time of the late 2000s, but their solution is just having the player do the boring, shallow scripted events. In the case of the modern Rockstar open-world games, it often introduces a world filled to the brim but has nothing interesting to do besides slow walking, the scripted events of slowly following someone, slowly riding the horse as the NPC shoves expositions, getting animation locked whenever I try to do anything to waste my precious time on irrelevant mini cutscenes for the sake of cinematic immersion. Maturity. People misdiagnose Red Dead Redemption 2's problem as it is bad because it is slow. In reality, the problem has nothing to do with the slow-paced gameplay. It is that things that make Redemption 2 slow are not gameplay at all. So many mechanics seem to be designed to be immersive or realistic instead of fun, and mechanics that could be immersive and realistic while enhancing the gameplay don't exist. It fails at making the mundane and immersive stuff relevant to the core gameplay experience. You have a game that has an incredible snow physics system that has the player leave accurate tracks on the snow, but this doesn't lead to anything substantial, like, let's say in Metal Gear Solid 1, in which the enemies would follow your footprints in the snow.
Huh? Whose footprints are these?
The mud gets on your clothes, and people can comment on mud being on you.
Man, you sure seem to love mud.
But that mud cannot be used for anything creative, like let's say, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, in which you can apply mud as camouflage to conceal yourself. If you don't take a bath, people will comment on your hygiene.
Mr. Morgan, you're quite a sight. You're revolting, and you'll get all of us sick.
But it's not like Metal Gear Solid 5, in which enemies can smell you and will try to find the source if you are nearby. The balls of horses shrink in cold areas. How does that affect what the player is doing? What does that even affect? Does it mean anything? The answer is no. It is pointless. What's the point in having these details when you can't do much with them? They are cool, but they are hardly even relevant. They cannot be used freely or in the ways the player wants in order to have any level of freedom with them. It is frustrating to see how the developers and critics ramble on about immersion, yet seemingly forget that you have to be immersed in something. A lot of people associate immersion solely as non-interactivity, slow-walking scripted section, cinematic experience, some fancy animations, and bloody screen and lens flare. Yet if the gameplay does not create a player narrative, There is no actual reality for the player to immerse himself. How Rockstar still goes for this approach to the open world to this date is beyond me. Even for scripted linear games, the rigid, follow the orders or game over is an awful game design. That's why the Call of Duty campaigns have been reviled for a long time, and they didn't do as much as Red Dead Redemption 2 does. Metal Gear Solid 5 has weird little details like a horse that can shit on your command, but that shit can be used as a tactical move to disarm an oncoming vehicle. These are, in my mind, what make the game immersive because the game reacts to the player's inputs in a meaningful way and allows the player to have an emergent narrative. My favorite slow-paced open-world games like Gothic, Long Dark, Morrowind, Pathologic, Far Cry 2, Stalker, Disaster Report, Mafia 1, Original, Kingdom Come Deliverance, and Death Stranding are even slower than Red Dead Redemption 2, but much of the mundanity serves an actual purpose for having actual systems that loop to the core interconnected gameplay. They have tons of mundane moments and details, and that is very much at the heart of the core experience. That's what you call details that actually matter to the gameplay or add to the immersion. They didn't waste time on flexing production value while the gameplay is an embarrassment of game design. I would complain about bad animations or blocky models of these games, but I can't hear myself complain when I'm immersed in my own head, and then all the frustration of such old and outdated stuff goes out the window. These games didn't shit the bed the moment you want to do anything outside of the scripted, charted course by the level designers like the Rockstar developers did. You have to use your brain, like planning things out, figuring out how to achieve your goals, juggling between long-term and short-term goals, and focusing on the moment-to-moment gameplay dynamics and player narratives. These are what made these games slow. Whereas Redemption 2 is slow because, whoa, stop and watch Arthur opening a cupboard and then having to reach into the cupboard to take a can of baked bean for 10 seconds every time you loot. Realistic and cinematic. It's not that Red Dead Redemption should turn into an immersive sim. It's about them not letting you take even a simple step from the path they have ready for you. Find me another game that shits the bed if you step in the wrong direction.
I see some smoke to the east. Maybe another camp? It's worth a look.
All right, let's go.
Yep.
Missions are so incompetently designed that they literally designed to be played in a very particular way, and if they aren't, then the missions fail. I had very little enjoyment trying to play a handholdy experience that otherwise just boiled down to take cover and shoot. Most missions are about the player going to a marker on your map and waiting for the game to prompt you with what to do next. If you ever use your initiative before the game wants you to, the player gets slapped with a gamer over screen or, at best, the NPC says,
Arthur, what are you doing?
Go hide behind that specific rock marked yellow on your minimap and wait until control returns to you. As soon as you deviate from the path Rockstar wants you to take, the mission breaks. If the game gives the player control over a character, then give them full control. Don't give the player control while putting a yellow spot on the map and failing me whenever the player decides to step out of it. Missions should have freedom instead of following strict steps. It does not require a massive change in the story if it lets the player make their own way across the rooftops instead of going through the main door. Not letting the player come up with their own solution for the problem at hand is truly a 5th-gen game design. Just let the player flank the enemies another way than it wants the player to. Games should be a collaborative effort between the game and the players in creating immersion because players are the co-authors of the experience. I for one already know what I am playing is a game, and even in the most reactive game like Deus Ex and Ultima 7, there are certain things you can't do in it. Rockstar, on the other hand, went, no, games are immersive, and we will remind you every single time you get, only to create a game that has as many immersive elements as the non-immersive elements that make you question the design choices and the time Rockstar's wasted on absolutely nothing instead of fleshing out the missions or side missions or making the gameplay itself more engaging, fun, and experimental. If the game keeps restricting the player and failing them for trying to be creative in a game it told them it's fine to be creative 2 minutes ago, it shatters that immersion. Then count how many missions revolve around the same pattern of sneaking somewhere, getting detected, taking cover, and shooting everyone, fleeing on horseback, shooting more guys, and reaching the mission-ending spot. Repeat. There is rarely a creative thought put into making each combat encounter interesting. The game throws hundreds same enemies at the player, and the player just takes cover and goes shooty-shooty like it's barely a sweat. There are more times I failed missions because I did something I wasn't supposed to do than actually dying. Red Dead Redemption 2 has no real mechanical dynamics to speak of. The encounters are handpicked and controlled by the developers. You play the encounter one time to figure out all the patterns, and upon replay, the encounters are basically the same. Nothing changes because the levels, missions, and combat encounters aren't flexible or offer any level of creativity beyond the standard cover shooting. This is also one of the inherent problems with the cover shooter genre itself. The problem with cover shooters is that the cover mechanic is not just an option for the player to use in certain situations, but it is often the only option. Stand up and shoot and hide and heal is the entire combat loop with little to no variety to shake things up. It is a no-risk and high-reward system. Outside of the grenade attacks that are easily avoided, there is no circumstance where not hiding in cover is advantageous. The cover system breaks the flow of the combat. Just huddling behind a cover and peeking out and shoot, then hide until the health regenerates is the single worst combat design for any game to rely on, especially when the game is all about aggressive action game. Waiting and not doing anything is never fun. It is not fun in movies, and it is not fun in games. It is inherently inactive. Combine that with the sluggish movement, slow enemies, generous aiming, deadeye, hit-skin weapons, and the regenerating health. In most of the fights, I just found a cover and stayed there for the entirety of the combat encounter. There is a certain purity in Revolver to be admired. It has no fat. It is just about shooting and nothing else. Instead of doing a ton of stuff without doing any of them all that well, Revolver only focuses on a few elements and does them exceptionally. All the elements feel connected and seem like the same team worked on every game element. All the elements coming together to form a singular experience rather than slapping different elements together. Red Dead Revolver has a linear narrative and progression and follows a linear level structure. There is a starting point and an end point, and they don't change, but everything in the middle is up to the player. How you fight the bad guys is dynamic and up to your whims and skill as a player. A linear narrative doesn't have to have narrow, linear gameplay. Basically, each combat beat within the levels is treated like a small, interconnected sandbox arena. The player freedom is the core gameplay experience, which is why the levels are designed the way they are. There is no moment where the player has to slowly follow an NPC, shoving expositions down the player. It doesn't give the player a mission fail screen unless you literally fail a mission goal or die. So why is a linear PS2 shooter from 2004 freer in its mission design and structure than an open-world game in 2018? Just because Red Dead Redemption 2 is an open world that technically has a larger map, it doesn't make the encounters freer. Then there is like a comparable set piece, level, and diversity in the linear 7-hour game to the 100-hour open-world game. There is an effort to make each level feel distinct and fit with the different themes. One level is the shootout on a speeding train, which clearly inspired the train level in Uncharted 2. Then you fight a guy who strapped himself with dynamites and charges at you in a Prey versus Predator-type level. Then you get a horror-themed level where you have to protect a girl from the clowns and the teleporting magician. Then you get a long-range firefight in the valley and eventually fight a dominatrix cowgirl. Then you fight a Django-inspired villain who whips out a machine gun from a coffin in a ghost town. Then you get a saloon fistfight. Then you fight the US Army in the massive bridge battle inspired by the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you have to use flares to bombard the US artilleries. And this barely covers the first half of the game. There are crazier and more unique levels peppered throughout the experience. Almost every level feels like a Western stereotype realized in the interactive form. Even from the gameplay perspective, each level requires different moment-to-moment gameplay, forcing the player to adapt new tactics so it doesn't get repetitive like the Redemption games do. While the story is essentially more of a parody of the Western genre than a subversion like the Redemption games are, and often just an excuse to show off the set pieces and stages, it doesn't matter. It's still entertaining from beginning to end because everything is creative. The locations are varied and unique. The villains are unique and badasses. The set pieces are cool. Even the loading screens are dripping with the Western flares. The Redemption games don't put much thought into the creative elements because of their focus on cover shooting, realism, and open world. It is refreshing to see great care in locations, villains, henchmen, set pieces, and level/mission design. It's great to see these absurd elements stick to the arcade vibe without going into the ironic Marvel-like zoomer humor of the 2020s. Yes, the style is absurd, but there is a genuine sincerity to it, almost like a platinum game. This is more to do with Redemption 2 than Redemption 1, but Red Dead Redemption 2's combat system is passive, and passive, The problem is not that it's just slow. The problem is that Redemption 2's combat is unresponsive, clunky, and lacks challenge. You can't die. The player movement is sluggish, and each animation takes a delay. It plays so automated and unnecessarily clunky at the same time. Rather than embodying an on-screen avatar with the controller, it is like the player is controlling a submarine. The player has a laggy movement, near unlimited slow-mo, rigid auto-aim, and regenerating health, forcing them to take cover or abuse Deadeye, which takes skills and fun away. If you play normally, you lock onto enemies with no effort. If you turn the auto-aim off, it's just unplayable. The deeper you get into the game, the simpler the combat gets. From the beginning to the end, RDR's combat never changes. Hide behind cover, shoot bad guys in the head. Repeat. Most of the level design has the player stuck in a horizontal battlefield plane with only cover-based shooting. There is little to no verticality. The combat becomes a peek-out-and-shoot loop that lacks any ounce of tactical variety. This is why every single firefight feels roughly the same. This is not even mentioning an awful, clunky melee system, which is just getting the player locked in a chain of animations. The designers failed to make the combat in an open-world game revolving around combat fun, just a filler between the story cutscenes. But, it's realistic. Despite Rockstar's attempt, Red Dead Redemption 2 is nowhere close to being a sim or being realistic. It is a standard cover console third-person shooter with clunky movement, outdated aiming, and heavily controlled gameplay sequences. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the shooting is just tapping the trigger at the NPC until they fall to the ground. It doesn't matter what weapon you use, how you use it, or where you aim. There is a way to make a slow combat feel good to play and give a dynamic flow. Realistic shooters like Arma, Squad, and Tarkov offer a ton of freedom and opportunity, as well as a great depth in combat complexity. Even the non-milsim shooters like Metro, The Last of Us, Stalker, and Viet Cong construct an intense combat experience without the awkward movement and restrictions. These games have a punchy, weighty feel to the weapons, and there are various mechanics to play around the AI and the gunplay. And these games let the player immerse and engage in the head, not through the clunky attempts at cinematic or any gimmick in order to be a grounded shooter. The only real reason why the developers picked the cover shooting for Redemption 2 is because it felt cinematic and everyone else was doing it. However, Red Dead Revolver is the opposite. Not only every player input is snappy and the controls don't feel like fighting my hands, but Revolver has its own unique combat system that still stands out because the developers wanted to make a cowboy game with that gunslinger gameplay, not because they were following a trend. It is not really a conventional third-person shooter in the modern sense. It takes a while to adapt to its brutal difficulty, but once it clicks, it rocks. Once you get used to it, it is the only Rockstar game with a great combat system. Max Payne 3 is a close second, but ruined by the claustrophobically railroaded level design and progression. I wonder if the strong gameplay is the remnant of Capcom's game design. The way the character moves and the arcade feel of the game resemble a Japanese game more than a Western one. It has a good amount of mechanical complexity and flexibility with many quirks to exploit. It is tighter in enemy encounters, level design, and combat mechanics. It has a primitive cover system, but it didn't turn combat into just that. It is just one of the many viable options the player has depending on the situation. Revolver is all about movement, mainly due to the bullets being slow projectiles you can roll and dodge. This might not sound much, but this completely changes the combat dynamic. The gunfight is not about connecting dots anymore. Every bullet is dodgeable, both for enemies and the player. The player, they have to calculate when and where the bullet will land. The slow bullets encourage the player to be up close, rolling and avoiding constantly. You can charge at an enemy firing and avoid every bullet pouring at you if you're good enough. This results in the constant switching of the playstyle from the guns blazing in a continuous loop. Combat is strategic thanks to the variety of environments for fighting, and a variety of enemies too, plenty of bosses with not entirely clear weak points that you have to study and manipulate. Then there are various enemy types like the beefy guy with a melee weapon who charges at the player, or the sniper type, or the dwarfs that swarm the player, and the lean but fast guy. They attack differently and require different tactics. In addition, the different player characters require the player to fight differently. Unlike Redemption 2's melee system, which is just a quick-time event mini-cutscene, in Revolver, the player just whips and kicks. It's fast. It's intuitive. The game is way more dynamic, and its dynamic aspect is not handholdy as it allows the player to engage in the combat as they want. The game is really hard. The combat is both fanatical and deliberate. The damage output is high, and the health does not regenerate, but it's easy to avoid the enemy attacks, and the enemies often put themselves out in the open. This puts the player on the aggressive. When the player gets hit, it is often the player's fault. You are on the constant move. Standing in one place is a death sentence. The game is best to be played in an aggressive playstyle because it encourages a high-risk, high-reward playstyle in a messy gunfight. Almost every part of the level is interconnected, encouraging the player to hit and run with each enemy behaving in roles distinctly different from each other. There is rarely downtime, and the game can get exhilarating because of it. The level of fluent moment-to-moment gameplay is unmatched by any old or new Rockstar game. Afterward, Rockstar fails to make anything more than a combat system that cannot even match a 2004 shooter in terms of mechanical depth. Just compare your inputs at a combat level in Revolver. Out in the open, constantly rolling, dodging projectiles, moving, flanking, crowd control, the amount of skill, tactics, and thoughts required to deal with enemies, to any combat encounters in Redemption, which plays stationary. If you try to perform more than one action at a time in Redemption 2, the game will shit itself since the inputs are attached to long animations that aren't as responsive. See the difference in response time. See how much the game demands from the player. I find it sad that there seems to be so little serious discussion about Red Dead Redemption 2 as a game, but more about the story. No one is objecting to the notion that it is a well-polished AAA game with the story being the strongest aspect by a mile, but Red Dead Redemption 2 is a video game, and its gameplay is something that's not discussed about much. The general impression I get from people is that they only play the Redemption games and never touch Red Dead Revolver because it's old. I watch YouTube videos and people just laugh it off because of how ridiculous the character models look. They talk as if the Red Dead series started with Redemption and ignore the actual starting point that was Red Dead Revolver. It's just to show that the sequel could be screwing up and people wouldn't notice due to not playing the past game and knowing better. Despite the sequel's titles being Red Dead, they sure don't play like the evolution of Red Dead Revolver. Unfortunately, the Redemption games have already erased Revolver from the minds of people who never played it because they thought playing the Redemption games was enough for them. I'd say give Red Dead Revolver a chance, because yes, Rockstar can do better, and has proven they could, within the same franchise. You will find out it has some of the most fun third-person shooting out there. There are indeed non-cover shooters in the third-person shooter genre, and they tend to be better. All of the modern cover shooters are pretty much sticking to the genre conventions without really doing much with it. All of them feel conventional and outdated by comparison. Revolver's tight controls, dynamic and range of movements, and the others all elevate the game to a level that very few third-person shooters can measure up to. I hope Rockstar would do a game like Red Dead Revolver, Max Payne 3, and Manhunt again, a smaller production, more specific, aiming for a specific niche, and more linear rather than making another GTA or Redemption game. Many fans don't like or play them because they have a different approach from an average GTA-type open world. But Rockstar used to experiment with through types of gameplay across their works. That's when Rockstar is the strongest. This is coming from someone who played most Rockstar games from GTA 2 to Red Dead Redemption 2.